Hello and welcome to the American Museum of Fly Fishing's landmark exhibit. It's the first of its kind. It's called On Fly in the Salt, America's saltwater fly fishing from surf to the flats. In this exhibit, we'll tell you stories of fascinating people, places, and innovations in fly fishing gear. A few words about the American Museum of Fly Fishing. It's the largest in the country with 163,000 fishing items to share with you and whose stories we share with you. I'm Nancy Zakan, trustee of the museum, and I'm very proud to present to you Andy Mill, our narrator. Andy is an Olympic skier twice over and fell in love with fly fishing and has now won more tarpon tournaments than anyone else on record. Andy is you could think of him as the Tiger Wood of tarpon tournaments. He and his son have produced Millhouse podcasts, viewed in 97 countries. Andy, take us on our journey.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you for the kind words. From the glassy mosaics of Clearwater Flats to the fierceness of the open ocean, saltwater fly fishing serves up a mix of mental and physical challenges that delivers sheer primal excitement. For many, the sport seems a recent phenomenon that burst onto the angling stage during the late 1950s. In fact, it is as ancient as all angling. In America, fly fishers took long rods to the salt as early as the 1760s. However, it was the late 1920s and into the 30s and 40s when pioneers like Tom Loving, Homer Rhodes, and Harold Gibbs began to attract the attention of inquisitive anglers. These groundbreaking fly fishers were explorers and innovators. They brought tackle designed for freshwater trout and salmon to the saltwater fish in bays, surf, and even deeper offshore zones. It is their work, along with the technological advances, that led to the near-explosive development of the sport from the late 1950s through the 1970s, sometimes referred to as saltwater fly fishing's golden era. They represent the tenacity, passion, and leadership of the many visionaries who made saltwater fly fishing what it is today. Flip Powlett once remarked the sport is coursing with adventure of travel and fish that could stop a freight train. Here's Flip now. He's known as the fly fishing world's Aldo Leopold.
Thinking back, I think my first involvement in saltwater fly fishing probably stems back to adventures along the Tamiami Trail Canal, a canal that runs all the way from Miami across the state to Tampa. And as kids, we used to plug cast for snook in that canal religiously when we should have been in school. Myself and Chico and Norman Duncan and John Emery. And one day, plug fishing there, we drove up in my ancient pickup on two guys who were fly fishing for snook on the trail. First time I had ever seen it. It was Ted Williams and a guy named Rocky Weinstein. They were buddies and fly fished the trail for snook all the time. And Chico and I stood there and watched these men fly cast and were amazed. I mean, we had no idea what they were doing or why, and we followed them for hours watching them catch snook on a fly rod. And we knew immediately that we had to do this. And fortunately, Ted Williams loved young people. I'm not sure he liked older people that much, but he really loved young people and he really liked fisher folk. So he was willing to share with us and help me get started, recommending rods and lines and reels and so forth. And so that was really my very, very first exposure. And because I was young and had time, no disposable income as I recall, but tons of time, I was able to cleave to it immediately and spend time doing it and learn and begin a life of it. I think my television work over the years probably has influenced saltwater fly fishing in two ways, probably, hopefully. One would be the ethic of fly fishing in general, but specifically saltwater, because I've been exposed or have exposed people more to saltwater fly fishing than to freshwater, and I hope that the ethic of that kind of fishing gets across to the public. That's what my hope is. My feeling is that it does. But the whole being in touch with the natural world as you fly fish, the whole catch and release aspect of fly fishing, I think is one of the messages that I've tried so hard over years to deliver, and hopefully it's found its way. The other way that I think my work has influenced people with regard to saltwater fly fishing is to show them what's possible with a fly rod. People have always thought historically that fly rods were tools for catching trout or sunfish, or maybe largemouth bass, but blue marlin have only in recent years figured into people's perception of what can be done with a fly rod. And so, because of the great good fortune of what I was able to do and the places that I was able to travel with a fly rod in saltwater, it gave people to realize what they could do, that they could bone fish, that they could fish for tuna and sailfish and marlin and snapper and every manner of saltwater fish. Virtually every single saltwater fish is a candidate for the saltwater fly rods. And so those two ways, I think, are the major impacts that I've had.
Let's see how saltwater fly fishing began in America. While we were still a colony of Britain in 1764, Rodney Hume, working for the new British governor of the West Florida colony, wrote, "We have plenty of saltwater trout and fine fishing with fly in the freshwater rivers too." In the 1800s, Jerome Smith authored Natural History of Fishes of Massachusetts, where he described Cape Cod fishing for salters and fly fishing for striped bass. So popular were the striped bass that in the late 1800s, the fish car, a train with 450 small striped bass from the East Coast, departed Red Bank, New Jersey, and headed west. The fish were contained in milk cans and attended by J.G. Woodbury, who supplied fresh water and oxygen through physical labor. Amazingly, 300 small striped bass survived the transcontinental trip. Here is Nick Curcione, the seeker of saltwater's furthest horizon and a West Coast angler par excellence.
In terms of fly tackle developments that I was very thrilled to be like a part of, one was very minor, but it's a very, I regard it as a very important component, is the handle on a fly reel. And maybe this is for, coming from my years as a tuna fisherman on the long-range trips using the Big Pen International reels. They have handles the size of mini footballs and everything else. Because when you're on big game fish, you got to really crank. And the handle, ergonomically, is very important. So Ted Jurassic, who makes the T-bore reel, Ted and I are very, very good friends. And I had some input on what he markets as the gorilla handle on some of his T-bore reels, which is a very large handle, kind of looks like a capstan, that they tie up the large ships with on the docks. I think ergonomically that's the most comfortable. One of what I would call the significant changes that I have added to my fly fishing repertoire is the use of the two-handed or the double-handed rod. In 2000, when I was living on the East Coast in Connecticut, I started to use the two-handed rods for my surf fly fishing. When you're standing on the beach, distance is absolutely critical. And again, the lever principle, the longer the lever, the easier the task. And I was with Thomas & Thomas at that time, the rod company, and they made some beautiful two-handed rods. But practically no one was using them in the States. The whole spey thing had really not taken hold in the US. Now, I wasn't spey casting, but I started casting overhead with the double-handed rods and was able to get tremendous distance with relative ease, distances that you just, you couldn't get with a single-handed rod.
About the same time, tarpon lured anglers to the Florida Keys, as books like Dr. James Herschel's Camping and Cruising in Florida contributed to the increased popularity of angling for tarpon. The fish were subject to wanton killings in the name of sport. Impassionate pleas by pioneering anglers resulted in Florida giving tarpon its initial game fish designation. In the early 1900s, W. Dimmock's seminal Book of the Tarpon was published. Dimmock's full-blown text, along with his son's astonishing action photographs, galvanized immediate focus and pursuit of tarpon by adventurous anglers. The book was truly a first in describing the tarpon fishery along Florida's west coast down to the Upper Keys. It was a Bible for the sport at the time and remains a highly entertaining and informative read today. As the Florida Keys became more accessible to anglers through new rail and road building, the Long Key Fishing Club hosted notables such as Zane Grey, famous fishing author and angler. With more out-of-town anglers, not only were more fishing guides needed, but also more conservation and protective legislation. In 1930, the Florida Keys Fishing Guides Association was formed, and the group has been responsible for some of the great inroads in conserving the fisheries of America's unique and irreplaceable shallow water marine life. Though fiercely individualistic, guides worked together in establishing new bag limits among their own members. In 1938, Wallace Hume Carruthers, a DuPont chemist, invented nylon. The synthetic was first used as toothbrush bristles, then used to form a fine thread used to create nylon stockings. Nylon eventually replaced silkworm gut for leaders, the front part of the fishing line near the fly. In the 1940s, the Orvis Company's rod designer, Wes Jordan, perfected a method of impregnating bamboo with bakelite, an early plastic, producing stronger, more durable rods. The technique was used in the first striper rods for master outdoorsman Harold Gibbs. In 1946, Shakespeare produced the Wonder Rod using the Howald process, creating tapered tubular fiberglass rod blanks, using a balsa wood core around which the fiberglass fibers were laid. During that same year, the Harnell-Harrington Rod Company built and sold excellent tubular fiberglass rods and blanks. At first, they only made freshwater bass-oriented rods, but the company quickly expanded into big-game saltwater rods. Their rods were dressed in a gleaming black finish, which stood out in contrast to Shakespeare's white wonder rods. In 1952, Leon P. Martucci was working on an innovating fishing line in his home kitchen. He devised a method for tapering the PVC coating over more easily constructed level-braided nylon cores. This process eliminated the time-consuming tapering of the braided cores themselves. Martucci tested durability of his coatings by dragging the line sections behind his car headed to fishing outings. In 1957, Stu App turned from airplane pilot to professional guide in the Keys, and he was the go-to tarpon man of the hour. Here's Stu now, fly fishing's all-time tarpon master.
I became a professional guide when I got laid off from Pan Am. I got out of the Navy in December '55, off active duty, and went to work for Pan Am. Pan Am flew to all the great places of the world to fish, so that, of course, had to be my airline. Little after a year of being with them, they laid me off. My dad said, "What are you going to do? Go to work for American Airlines or United? They were wooing you when you got off active duty." And I said, "No, Dad. I'm going to do something I always wanted to do." I'm going to get my captain's license, be a backcountry bonefish guide down in the Florida Keys. And he started laughing. He said, no, son, no, really, what are you going to do? And I said, that's what I'm going to do, and that's what I did. And it was one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. I guess over the years I've been known as a tarpon guru, they say, but tarpon is the best fish to fish for with a fly. If you do it all right, they eat the fly. When you hook them, they are fantastic. They jump and run, and you got to do everything right in order to get them in quickly. I think it's important to get them in quick. If you don't get them in quick, they may die because of the lactic acid spill in their muscles. If you do it right, you can land a 100-pound tarpon in well under 20 minutes on 12-pound tippet. Now, as an example, I broke the world record twice in one day here in Florida on 12-pound tippet with tarpon. The first one in the morning was 162 3/4 pounds. In the afternoon, I got one that was 164 pounds, and it was the IGFA world record both times. So you have to know how to fight these fish, and you have to fight them well. I was a boxer in my youth, Golden Gloves, college, and then in the Navy. And fighting a big fish is like boxing. There are times that you have to jab and back up. There are times when the fish is almost near finished. If you're hurting, you better keep on going. Don't give it a break. Get it in quickly. And a quick fight, quick release makes it good for the fish, it's good for you, and it's good for your buddy if you have a buddy fishing with you, because he'll now get a chance to fish while the bite's on. Back in my guiding days, back in the 50s, mid to late 50s and the early 60s, the tarpon were really, really dumb. They hadn't been harassed, so you get a fly or a lure near them, they generally eat it if you did it halfway right. But some of the areas I fished were really clear, crystal clear water in the lower Florida Keys. And the flies that were the flies of the day were much larger, and they were tied from the eye of the hook back, the divided wing streamers. And when you'd false cast them, the tail of the fly would get wrapped around the bend of the hook. And that would end up, it's all over if that happens. So I started trying to figure out how to do something different. Started tying the flies, the streamer part, all the way back at the bend, and so that it couldn't wrap around the hook. And I started tying smaller flies, and that was what was called the apt tarpon fly. And the one that was on the U.S. postage stamp in 1991 is the orange and yellow one that was the artist's rendition of that. Lefty Kreh has his fly also in 1991 on that strip of stamps.
In the 1950s, Gar Wood Jr. prototyped a machined aluminum saltwater reel. A finished model is presented to his friend and skilled angler, Charlie Dunn. The Finnor Company contracts to build 4 sizes of this classic wedding cake design reel, produced between 1967 and 76. The number 3 reel became the go-to tarpon fly reel. The casting great Myron Gregory realized the need for distance casting from shore rocks and jetties, as well as quick-sinking lines to reach deeper fish in fast currents. He pioneered the use of lead core shooting tapers attached to fine-diameter shooting lines. In 1959, Gregory did just that with fly lines and created the now industry standard of using weight of the line's first 30 feet, producing numbers like 1-weight to 15-weight lines and rods. In 1963 to 1966, Joan Wolfe competed in the Islamorada Gold Cup Tarpon Tournament against top male anglers. She broke the glass ceiling and won many tournaments, which paved the way for today's women fly fishers. More about Joan later. In 1964, Lee Cuddy became the first to take an Atlantic sailfish on fly, and competitive record-keeping began. Also in 1964, the Saltwater Fly Rodders of America was founded in Seaside Park, New Jersey. Fred Schreier spearheaded the organization's launch. Rules for fly rod records were established, written by Mark Sosin. In 1968, Sosin turns over these fly fishing records and record-keeping duties to the International Game Fishing Association. Here's Mark Sosin's saltwater fly fishing's consummate communicator.
You know, when you look back at your career and what you've done for saltwater fly fishing, and what you've done that have helped others. And I reflect on that from time to time. And one of the things, for example, I discovered that if you fish a fly in a chum slick without moving it, it works. If you retrieve in a chum slick, it doesn't. I publicized this. It became common knowledge. And I think that probably my greatest contribution as a journalist has been writing about this, going all over and talking to people, coming up with the latest ideas, publicizing them in newspapers, magazines, through a book that I wrote on fly fishing, and through television, making people aware of what can be done and what is being done and the latest techniques. And I think that has been an overpowering help to a lot of people. And also, one more thing, just convince them that, hey, you can do it. It doesn't take a tremendous skill. Anybody can do this thing if you just apply yourself.
You know, when we started really promoting saltwater fly fishing, and we formed the Saltwater Fly Rodders of America, which was the brainchild of the late Fred Schreier, and his concept was to move it all across the coastal states of the United States with various chapters. And I was on the board of directors, one of the founding members. And I looked at this and I said, you know, we need to standardize the tackle so that everybody is playing with a level playing field. They're all using tackle within the limits that are determined. And I said to the board, also, if we keep the records, then people will know what has been done and they will be able to go out and either exceed the record or know that somebody else caught a larger fish. They said, that's a wonderful idea. Why don't you write the rules? I did that in 1965. We had a first national conclave in 1966 where we unveiled these rules. And I kept the records, and I was meticulous about them. I walked into IGFA to Elwood Harry, who was the president at that time, and we used to have lunch together quite frequently. And I said, Elwood, have I got a deal for you? And I talked them into taking the world records. They've kept them ever since, and they're pretty much the rules that I wrote with very few changes.
In 1965, Lefty Kreh took on directorship of the Metropolitan Miami Fishing Tournament, the Met, now South Florida's fishing tournament, beginning his rise to become one of fly fishing's true legends and tactical wizards, especially in the saltwater arena. Here is Lefty Kreh, the Thomas Edison of fly fishing.
I started saltwater fly fishing back in, I think it was 1947. I didn't keep a record on it those days, but Joe Brooks had given me some lessons on fly casting, and there were no fly fishermen that I knew of in Maryland at the time. I finally found 3 guys in Baltimore, but I had been catching striped bass with different kinds of surface lures and jigs. So I thought, well, why wouldn't they work in saltwater too? So it was rather amusing because I didn't know what I was doing. I caught some fish because there were lots of them at the time. But the amusing part was that nobody on Chesapeake Bay that I knew of, or they knew of, had ever seen anybody flail on one of those things out there. And so I got started there, and then went on from there. But that was my first place I ever started fly fishing. I think the greatest contribution I've made, which is still not readily accepted, particularly for saltwater, but for all fishing, fly fishing, is casting. In saltwater fly fishing, if you talk to guides in the Florida Keys, for example, the biggest problem is that the average freshwater fisherman who comes to saltwater cannot fly cast, and it's because they cast this way, instead of using their body and taking the rod back much further behind them. So the method that I use, and it's now it's universal in the saltwater fly fishing, and the truth of the matter is that when I go to somewhere like New Guinea or the Amazon and I watch a native cast, they cast exactly what I've been teaching for 50 years. I've never seen a native cast this way in my whole time. Well, all these rockfish, or striped bass, which we call rockfish in Maryland, would come in every evening and just gorge themselves on all these parts of crabs. well, you could throw a fly in there and it was like rolling a wine bottle in a jail cell. I mean, something was going to jump on it right away. So we were fly casting, but almost all the flies in those days had a chenille body and a feather wing, and they would underwrap. And oddly enough, even though those fish were in a feeding frenzy, they would not hit a fouled fly. I said, I'm going to design a fly that won't foul, that has a bait fish shape, that you can change size on it, and we're going to go back there and try it. And I did, and for the first couple of years, I just made an all-white deceiver. Nowadays, we have them in all different kinds of colors and all sizes, but this is basically what a deceiver is. It's nothing more than some hackles which are tied at the back so they wouldn't foul, they don't underwrap. And then you have a bucktail, and of course this thing is shaped like a fish. And then one of the things that's important is when this water goes back here and comes off of these bucktail here, which a collar, it actually puts many waves on here to make this work. And if it's wet, you can see that thing looks just like a fish when it's wet. This fly is used all over the world today, and it have many people that put their names on it, and I really don't care as long as they use it and have fun. But the fly itself is very light. It's virtually weightless, and marabou. I mean the mylar. I didn't come along with the mylar until I came down here in '64 to Miami, and when I was here, Mac McChristian, who was making Seamasters, had some wide, shiny stuff called mylars. And it was the first mylar strips I'd ever seen. And so I incorporated some of them. But this thing can be made that long, or it can be made that long. And they use it in fresh and salt water. But today it's probably one of the most popular saltwater flies in the world.
As the 1960s rolled on, so did the hunt for even bigger fish and more challenges. And in 1967, Lee Wolf, guided by Woody Sexton, took a 148-pound striped marlin off Salinas, Ecuador, proving that skill in fish fighting and boat handling could surmount tackle frailty. Wolf used an inexpensive fiberglass rod and reel with little or no drag. The record stood for almost 40 years. The 1970s were the golden years of Florida's west coast. Crystal River to Homosassa tarpon fishing, where the most famous anglers hunted for the elusive 200-pound tarpon fly rod record. In 1971, veteran Florida guide Bill Curtis invented the poling platform for flat skiffs. Tired of perching on the slippery cowling of his outboard motor, Curtis' elevated platform Brainstorm was built on his Hughes Bonefisher, the first platform and first produced Hughes flat skiff. Here's Bill Curtis, father of the poling platform.
When I was pulling the boat from the top of the motor, I figured I was going to fall off there and hurt myself. So I made a little drawing of a platform to go up above the motor and I took it, this little drawing down to Bob Hughes while I was running a Hughes Bonefisher. And he had the first poling platform welded out of aluminum tubing by pipe welders who built tuna towers and things like that. And at that time I was fishing for the big tarpon during the month of May and June up at Homosassa. And the first time I went up there with that poling platform on the boat, one of the guides up there, they were laughing at me, and one of them said, "What you got on there, Curtis, a fish cleaning platform?" I said, "No, it's to keep the motor in the shade. It makes it run cooler." You know, I just gave him the same back. And so I was the first guide up there to ever use the platform. They'd never seen any. But within about 6 or 8 years, every guide up there had a poling platform on his boat then.
I started saltwater fly fishing in Cuba in the year 1956. What happened is that I was born to a family of fishermen. My father fished, my uncle fished, everybody fished. They fished with hand lines and they fished with rods, no fly fishing. There was no fly fishing in Cuba in those days. But what happened is in 1956, my dad bought a yacht. And for some reason, he couldn't find a captain he liked in Cuba. He couldn't find the right person. He came to Miami, found a guy, and brought him to Cuba. It turned out that this fellow, Don, was a fly fisherman. I became enamored with the fly line in the air. Soon I was fly fishing for snook and baby tarpon and black bass in the Zapata swamp, and I stopped spin fishing quite a bit. And when communists came to Cuba and I left and came to the United States in 1959, I brought my fly rods with me, my Orvis bat and kill, which I still own, and a steel fly rod, which I no longer own, and came here. And the first person I met already fly fishing was Bill Curtis. And I continue learning from there. I met Flip Pallot in a tackle shop called the Tackle Box. In those days, 1959, that's where everybody met. There was no fly shops. This was a bait and spinning and maybe a little bit of fly fishing. The smell of live shrimp was all over the place because they have a live tank for bait fishing. And there were four of us of our same age that were fishing at that time: Flip Pallot, Norman Duncan, John Emery, and myself. And we became, I've written about this, we became the Four Musketeers. We were going to college, we were dating, double dating, and we were fly fishing. When we had time, maybe we would study a little, but mainly we fished. And I really learned to cast really well then. The four of us would go to University of Miami on the parking lot, and we would cast and cast and cast in the middle of the night with the lights that were in the parking lot. It was nothing for us to go on a double date on a Saturday night, come back at midnight, get in the car, split the gas that was already way up to 33 cents a gallon, and go to Key West. And arrive there at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and get on a skiff and go out and pull for tarpon, for permit. The fishing was fantastic then. My most exhilarating experience, the most exciting thing I've ever done, even beyond world records and the remote areas which I love and the explorations and everything that I have such a passion for, by far it has to be the time I fished with my son, Stephen. We started when we were young. I started him with bait, cutting bait with a little knife he had and putting bait on the hook and taking a little mangrove snapper off the hook and putting him on a pail and watching him swim and then releasing him as I did 65 years ago with my dad. But then he got more and more interested in fly fishing, which I was delighted. And so now we go fly fishing together. We still do that all the time. We go with fishing guys, and that's great. We've gone with Flip. I've gone with Bill Curtis. I've done a lot of fishing with Bill Curtis with my son. But what's really exciting is when he and I go alone and we look for fish, that communication back and forth. Dad, I think you're too high up in the flat. No, I think they should be tailing here. No, this is too back and forth. And then we hook a big fish. That's so exciting that I just can't stand it.
1976 master machinist Ted Jurassic built the very first Billy Pate tarpon reel, using Pate's criteria for specific fishing needs. Later, Jurassic would also build a bonefish-sized reel with Pate's name on it. It is also in 1976 that the John Emery tarpon reel is introduced, made from bar stock aluminum, with an exposed rim, ventilated spool, and massive drag. In the 1970s, the National Coalition for Marine Conservation, now known as Wild Oceans, was founded by anglers and is the U.S.'s oldest public advocacy group, dedicated to conserving ocean fish and their environment by stopping overfishing, reducing bykill caused by indiscriminate fishing gear, and stemming the loss of critical marine habitat. In 1977, the Coastal Conservation Association was created as a grassroots, nonprofit social movement organization of saltwater anglers spanning the Gulf of Mexico, Atlantic, and Pacific Oceans. Its mission is the restoration and conservation of coastal marine resources for the benefit and enjoyment of the general public. In 1980, scientific anglers introduced the first economical saltwater reel that stood up to the rigorous conditions of saltwater fishing, designed by Bob Stearns of Miami at a retail price of $100. In 1993, Jack Charleston's big game fly reels are launched. With no-slip drag settings, these reels set a new standard and were among the first to use brake lining material for the drag. And the flats boats of Florida go north to New England. In 1978, Captain Jeff Northrup pioneered saltwater fly fishing in flat skiffs in the Northeast, fishing Connecticut's Norfolk Islands. In the mid-1990s, California native Paul Dixon, who had been running the fishing department at Orvis's New York City store, as well as fishing Long Island at every opportunity, began developing the first sight fishing fly fishing charter service from the Hamptons to Montauk. At the same time, the decline of tarpon fishing caused widespread concern, Florida's Fisheries Commission directive making killing a tarpon illegal without having a permit. In 1997, the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust was founded to protect and enhance critical habitats, reverse the decline of flat species, and use research findings to influence policy and improve resource management for long-term stewardship. Then it happens in 2000. James Holland of Vancouver, Washington, takes the Holy Grail. The quest for a 200-pound tarpon on fly ends on May 11th with Holland's catch of a lifetime, a 202-pound, 8-ounce Silver King off Florida's West Coast. Here are the record catches at a glance. In 1939, Bill Smith takes the first bonefish, 8 pounds, Islamorada, Florida.
I got him. Fish on. Woo! What a tiger! Woo! What a slap! What a fish! Oh! Oh, look at him! Woo! There he is, fish on. I got him. I got that fish. Look at him go. Man, he's gonna leave the drift.
Women also have an important place in saltwater fly fishing, and here are a few of their stories. Kay Brodney. Kay's love affair with fly fishing evolved into a life of international adventures, fishing places few others had discovered. Early in her career, she was a top accuracy and distance caster. Her fishing spanned the Florida Keys, where her largest tarpon of 137.6 pounds on 12-pound test tippet was observed by baseball great Ted Williams. While on expedition throughout South America, toughing it under primitive living conditions, she became one of the first anglers to ever take a golden dorado on fly. Bonefish Bonnie. Georgia native Bonnie Laylaw was fortunate to meet George LeBranche, who recognized her keen fly fishing interest. He hired guide Preston Pinder to teach her how to fly fish in the Florida Keys where she was living. Bonnie married Keys guide Bill Smith, to whom honors go for the first specifically targeted bonefish on a fly rod. Bonnie's two sisters joined her in the Keys, and the trio began guiding when their husbands entered the service during World War II. Once Bill returned, the couple built a top celebrity client list. Bonnie, who became known as Bonefish Bonnie, guided angling author Joe Brooks to his first bonefish. Soon thereafter, Bonnie became the first woman to catch a permanent fly, and its size set a record held for 20 years. Dottie Ballantyne. Fly angler and Montana conservationist, Dottie was introduced to saltwater fly fishing in 2000. She began collecting records on light tippets, 2, 4, 6-pound tests, which became her specialty with 110 world records, including lemon sharks, mutton snappers, horse-eyed jacks, redfish, and cobia. In 2012, McCord began a world records pursuit, targeting specific tippet and line class records. She garnered the women's heaviest saltwater fly record, most catch and release records, and top female angler in 2015. In 2017, she owned 134 line class records. Jody Pate. In the late 1990s, her move to the Florida Keys sparkled a career in saltwater fly fishing. She held 17 world tippet records, competed in Keys fly tournaments, and campaigned to segregate IGFA's women's and men's fly tippet records. The separation was approved in 1998. Joan Wolfe. Though the First Lady of Fly Fishing is best known for her freshwater accomplishments, her saltwater success cannot be overlooked. Joan's introduction to saltwater followed a casting competition in 1950, when she headed to the Keys with companion and casting champ, the late John Diekerman. There, she instantly fell in love with the flats and was determined to make saltwater part of her life. From 1963 to 1966, she fly fished the Islamorada Gold Cup Tarpon tournament, competing against the heavy guns like Ted Williams, yes, the baseball player, who was also an avid fly angler. Back in the Keys, she caught her largest tarpon to date, a 125-pound tarpon on a 10-weight Winston rod. She was 78 at the time. Here's Joan.
No one ever acted as if I was someone different, that I was a woman. And you know, in those early days, there were two women guides, Frankie Albright and Bonnie Smith. They were married to the guides, Jimmy Albright and Bill Smith. So they were already accepted as knowing what they were doing in saltwater. They were pioneers. And so I never, as long as I could cast, that has always been what has gotten me through. Whether I'm a good fisherman or not, in terms of understanding the fish deeply, if I can cast, I'm accepted. The casting skills, you need to be able to deal with wind and be able to do single hauls for back winds, double hauls for good winds, shooting line on the back cast. Accuracy comes from your line hand as you shoot line, that controls it. And then sometimes the guide will suddenly say, fish behind you. And if you turn yourself around, you will hit the guide with your fly line. And so you must present on your back cast. So those are some of the skills that really are important in saltwater fishing.
Diane Rudolph. Saltwater Siren Song lured Diane shortly after her father introduced her to fly fishing. Following her dad's death, the biology major who contemplated grad school in fisheries decided on a career in the angling world. She worked for the Florida Keys Fly Fishing School as an instructor. From 2003 to 2009, she won 4 of the Women's World Invitation Tarpon tournaments and broke several world records. In 2004, Rudolph was the first woman to win the 30th Don Holly Invitational Tarpon Tournament against an all-male field. Lorianne Murphy. In 1989, Lorianne, first woman guide at Orvis, later helped to create the company's first women's fly fishing school and was instrumental in launching Orvis's collection of women's angling clothing. With friend Christy Ball, she founded the immediately successful Real Women Fly Fishing Adventures in 1994. Kathy Beck. The guiding service in school at Kathy and Barry Beck's Fly Shop became a springboard for the couple's national and international fishing travel, resulting in photos and stories that appeared in every major angling publication. Invariably, Kathy was the angler in the couple's photo essays, tackling species from locations that ranged from the flats to blue water. Camille Egdorf. Her parents' Alaska's trout fishing camp sparkled Camille's love for fly fishing. She began guiding in Montana at the age of 18. In her words, I enjoyed watching people catch fish more than catching them myself. Her talents led to work with Yellow Dog Fly Fishing Adventures, where she manages programs on Christmas Island and in Alaska. Nancy Zakan. Working for the Orvis Manhattan store, Nancy held casting clinics in Central Park, New York, helped design Orvis's first all-women's fishing school, as well as women's fishing clothing. In 1995, she founded Juliana's Anglers and Sporting Club, a women's fly fishing and field sports club in New York City. After moving to Key Largo, Florida, she founded the Bonefish Bonnies, another women's fishing club now with 200 members. Nick Lyons, fishing author and publisher, called her the Johnny Appleseed of women's fly fishing, planting women's fishing clubs wherever she goes. We've talked about the pioneers in all but fly design innovations. Today's finest fly tyers utilize a balance of natural and man-made materials to produce a variety of shapes, movement in water, subtlety of color, sink rate, sound, flash, and durability in their patterns. Here are a few groundbreaking flies. Stu Apt's Tarpon fly. Introduced by Apt in 1958, the design became the model for all standard tarpon streamers, remaining virtually unchanged for years. Dan Blatton's whistle. First tied in 1964, the streamer became a series of patterns. Blatton engineered the fly to emulate a bucktail jig for striped bass in San Francisco Bay. The fly was tied to produce a proper profile regardless of the angle from which viewed. The fly was named for the whistling sound the open hole in the eyes produced during casts. Whistlers are a universal pattern and have taken hundreds of species worldwide. Bill Galash's White Bomber. This was saltwater's first truly large popper, developed through the late 50s to the early 60s. Its target was big saltwater species, and it led to the way for other popper designs favored by Dr. Webb Robinson and Billy Pate. It is fairly light to cast despite its size and produces a loud sound. Lefty's Deceiver. Designed in the 1950s by the innovative Lefty Kreh, the pattern's unique positioning of bucktail alleviates the problem of tangled saddle hackle tails. The judicious blending of bucktail and saddle feathers makes for a light, easy casting without compromising the capability of creating a large profile when needed. The fly can be tied as short as 2 inches and longer than a foot for billfish, amberjack, and other species demanding a large offering. The Deceiver has become a true standard among saltwater streamers. Bendback fly. This is a style of tie adapted to many patterns. Bendbacks are universally tied, hook point up. The concept was developed in the 1800s in the Mid-South for fishing largemouth bass in lakes with heavy vegetation. In saltwater, the bendbacks became popular for fishing over grass and avoiding mangrove snags. Harold Gibbs striper bucktail. Originated in the 1940s, it was one of the first attempts at imitating a specific forage fish, the silversides. The stout, short shank, round bend hook tended to keep weight forward, encouraging a subtle head-dipping movement between strips, and also discouraged wing material fouling. Joe Brooks Blonde Series. Tied in the late 50s and 60s, primarily for Brooks by Richmond tyer Bill Galash, the design facilitates creating a fly with long profile, simulating larger forage fish. Also, the high-angled forward bucktail causes this wing to fold during retrieve, then flare. The simple pattern is equally effective in freshwater for large trout, and Brooks sang its praises highly for years. The Horror. Pete Perenchief, a great all-around angler who for 21 years was the director of the Bermuda Fishing Information Bureau, designed this pattern in the 1950s after a frustrating trip to the Florida Keys with Joe and Mary Brooks. Fishing for deep cruising bonefish, Brooks told Perenchief to let his fly sink to the bottom and wait for the fish to find it. Frustration produced a eureka moment in the middle of the night. Peter Rose tied a fly with the wing on the reverse side of the hook shank and dropped it into the bathtub to test. The Horror was born. It is a rather homely pattern with a wing of brown bucktail. The bucktail works like a rudder, turning the fly hook up on the descent and acting as a weed guard. In short order, virtually all bonefish patterns were tied with hook point up. The 1970s saw a handful of crustacean patterns, sometimes successful in coaxing strikes from shallow water permit. In 1984, Del Brown created his crab pattern of wool yarn strips laid at right angles across the hook shank and sometimes teased. The fly owes much of its success to rubber legs, which impart quite lifelike action, and its lead eyes that encourage a fairly swift descent, the reaction of a disturbed natural crab. Here is Nat Ragland called the Permit Nemesis.
Well, I got involved in saltwater fly fishing back in the 60s, and I'm really a kind of Johnny-come-lately compared to some of the boys that are going to be here today. But joined a fishing club in Miami, and one of the divisions was fly fishing, and I took to it. And after a lot of instruction and wearing a hole in the yard, I finally got fairly proficient in it. And then later on, after I became a guide, I concentrated a lot on fly fishing. All my anglers were fly rodders. Well, all you do is work and fish. She said, you have to give up one or the other. I said, okay, I'll give up work, and became a fisherman. The evolution of the puff fly came about by the reason that part of the divisions in our fishing club permit was one of these selected species. And nobody had been very successful in taking a permit on fly. Let me show you this fly. It's really very simple. It got eyes tied to the front of the hook and chenille, and a little bit of badger fur. And the feathers are called Kreh. And anybody that trout fishes knows what Kreh feathers are. And it's tied on an English hook. You can't get them anymore. It's called a 39 RMX. I think it was made by Partridge in England. But when you flow it out and work it, it kind of resembles a shrimp trying to elude a permit.
Through the 1970s, Bob Popovich's innovative techniques blazed through the tying world. His use of silicone and epoxy resulted in new patterns that were widely copied. And the bucktail deceiver, which uses natural materials while tying in all the fibers at once and distributing them with your fingers. Nauheim's Crazy Charlie. Bob Nauheim's game-changing bonefish fly was whipped up in the 70s after fishing with the Bahamian guide Charlie Smith. The story goes that Charlie kept commenting, "That fly, nasty." Nauheim renamed the pattern as Nasty Charlie. It worked extremely well in the Florida Keys and on Christmas Island. Lee Perkins, then president of Orvis, arranged to offer the pattern in the Orvis catalog. The name morphed to Crazy Charlie, and the rest is history. During the 1970s, Larry Dahlberg produced a series of spun deer hair surface bugs, initially for freshwater bass, northern pike, and muskie. Their unique feature is an angled collar just behind the head that causes the fly to dip into a quick, shallow dive during a sharp-lying strip. Clouser deep minnow. Throughout history, fly tiers have tinkered at their vices to create facsimiles of the leadhead bucktail jig, arguably the most effective yet simple hard lure ever devised. In 1987, Bob Clouser built a simple streamer pattern that utilized lead barbell-shaped eyes that had just been introduced for fly tying. Clouser's minimal use of bucktail allowed the weight of the forward-tied eyes to overpower the inherent floating qualities of the hair. That, in turn, enabled anglers to achieve a darting or drop-rise retrieve like a jig or fleeting forage fish. Cave's Wobbler, a fly that replicated the wobbling action of a metal spoon, one of the best lures for redfish, wasn't created until the early 1990s. That's when John Cave began using mylar tubing with the internal cord removed, and the tube flattened and epoxied once tied to an inverted hook shank. His configuration allowed the fly to wobble in a spoon fashion. The pattern has a pinch of hair and a few flash strips to emulate shrimp antenna. A wire weed guard completes the recipe. The Gurgler. Designed by a Boston cab driver, Jack Gartside, in the 1980s, the Gurgler has been hailed by many skilled anglers as the best topwater attractor one can use. It is tied using closed-cell foam. The fly is light and easier to cast than hard poppers. On the retrieve, it creates a seductive gurgling sound rather than the sharper pop of conventional poppers, and it easily collapses when taken by a fish, causing few misses. The crease fly. In the 1990s, Long Island, New York captain Joe Blados created a pattern he described as a round popper run over by a truck. The crease has a tall profile, narrow width, and a big open mouth. The body is built of soft foam covered with bright mylar foil, then folded and put on a hook. The crease fly achieved instant popularity and is fished all over the U.S. coast and internationally. A much larger, more complex version created by West Coast angler Ron Dong was designed for Baja's bigger predatory fish. And now, back to Nancy.
Thank you, Andy, for sharing your narration with us. We invite you to join with the American Museum of Fly Fishing in becoming a member, seeing us on Facebook, on Instagram, and on our website, amff.org. We'll share our latest exhibits with you and share more stories of fly fishing history. We look forward to keeping in touch with you and hope you enjoyed this presentation.